Have you ever stood before a landscape that felt empty? Not just quiet, but truly barren. This was Majuli Island in northeast India, a vast flat expanse of sand and silt in the immense Brahmaputra River. The river was slowly consuming the land, carving it away piece by piece with each monsoon season. What remained was a stark panorama of skeletal trees, their roots exposed to the air, monuments to a retreating forest. The ground was so dry and unstable it could barely hold a footprint. This was the stage in the late 1970s when a young man named Jadav Payeng witnessed a small tragedy that would define his life. He saw a cluster of snakes, washed ashore by the seasonal floods, lying lifeless on the hot sand. They had perished from the heat, with no shade to offer refuge. In that moment, the scale of the ecological crisis became painfully intimate. It was not an abstract problem of erosion. It was the absence of a single tree that could have provided shelter. For most, the logical response to such a daunting challenge would be to leave, to seek more fertile ground. But Jadav made a different choice. He decided to stay and to act. His plan was not grand. It began with a single, simple thought: to plant one bamboo seedling. And perhaps you have felt a similar barrenness when you first encountered the English language. Not the simple phrases for travel, but the vast, sprawling landscape of fluency. It can feel like an immense, featureless plain of grammar rules and unfamiliar sounds. The sheer scale of vocabulary needed can feel as daunting as trying to reforest an entire island. You see others who move through it with ease, their conversations providing shade and shelter, while you feel exposed on the open ground. The initial impulse might be to retreat, to stick to the small, familiar patches of your native language. But the decision to stay, to plant that first linguistic seed, is where every journey towards fluency truly begins. It is a choice to cultivate something from nothing. To fully appreciate the barrenness Jadav confronted, we must first understand the deep history of the land itself. The Brahmaputra River is not merely a waterway, it is an ancient, living force that has sculpted the landscape of northeast India for millennia. Its name, meaning son of Brahma, speaks to its revered and formidable presence in the region's culture. For centuries, Majuli Island thrived as a cultural and spiritual center, home to ancient Vaishnavite monasteries called satras, where art, music, and philosophy flourished. But the river's nature is one of constant change. It carries immense volumes of silt from the Himalayas, depositing it in vast sandbars while simultaneously eroding others. This natural cycle of creation and destruction accelerated dramatically in the 20th century. A major earthquake in 1950 altered the river's course and increased its sediment load, turning the gentle erosion into a relentless assault. Year by year, monsoon season after monsoon season, the Brahmaputra consumed the island's edges, swallowing villages, fields, and forests. The sandy soil Jadav walked upon was the result of this geological drama, a landscape shaped by forces that operated on a timescale far beyond a human life. His decision to plant a tree was not just a response to a momentary tragedy. It was an act of defiance against a historical tide of loss. So Jadav began. He took that first bamboo seedling and pressed it into the dry, unstable sand. The physical challenge was immediate. The sand offered little nourishment and even less stability. A strong wind could uncover the tender roots. A passing animal could trample it. There was no guarantee it would survive. And this act, repeated day after day, was met with understandable skepticism. What can one man possibly do against the forces of a mighty river and a changing climate? The question hung in the air, unspoken but felt. Yet Jadav understood something fundamental about the bamboo. It is what botanists call a pioneer species. It is a plant built for harsh conditions, one of the first life forms capable of colonizing damaged land. Its root system, called a rhizome, spreads underground, creating a network that begins to bind the soil together. It is the first fragile step toward stability, and then one day, a sign of life. A pale green shoot breaking through the gray sand. It was a small victory, invisible to anyone but him. But it was everything. It was proof that the barren ground could, in fact, support life. This is the phase of language learning that demands immense faith. The first weeks and months are like planting in that dry sand. You learn a new phrase, a grammar rule, a handful of vocabulary words. The effort feels immense and the result feels fragile. You try to use what you've learned and it feels awkward, unnatural. It's easy to feel the skepticism, both internal and external. What can these few words possibly do against the entire ocean of English? But these first words are your pioneer species. They are the hardy, essential structures that must be put in place first. They might feel simple, basic greetings, present tense verbs, common nouns. But they are the rhizomes that will eventually spread underground, creating a hidden framework for everything else. The first time you understand a sentence in a song or form a question without translating in your head is that first green shoot. It is a small, private victory. It is the moment you realize the ground of your mind can, in fact, support this new life. The work of cultivation has begun. While those first green shoots were the only visible sign of progress, the real transformation was happening beneath the surface. The bamboo's rhizome network was spreading silently through the sand, a subterranean web creating stability where there had been none. This unseen architecture began to perform a quiet miracle. It altered the microclimate of the soil itself. The network trapped moisture, creating tiny reservoirs of water that allowed the ground to retain life. With this new foundation laid, other species began to arrive. Jadav introduced secondary plants, trees that could not have survived the initial harshness, but now found a foothold in the slightly richer, more stable earth. The forest was beginning to design itself. Jadav's role shifted from pure labor to careful observation. He learned to read the subtle changes, the different quality of the morning dew, the way certain insects returned, the faint scent of damp earth that replaced the dry, dusty air. He was not just building a forest, he was learning to listen to it. This is the phase in language learning where the foundational work starts to pay unseen dividends. The basic grammar and vocabulary you cultivated begin to connect. You are no longer just memorizing individual words. You start to see the grammatical structures that bind them, the syntax that gives them order. This is the root system of fluency. It happens internally, often without dramatic external signs. You might not be speaking fluently yet, but your comprehension deepens. You start to understand the microclimate of a sentence, the subtle hints of tense, the nuance of a preposition. New words, the secondary species of your vocabulary, find a foothold more easily because they can attach themselves to this growing network. You begin to observe the language itself, noticing patterns in how native speakers construct phrases, the rhythm of their questions. You are no longer just a student of vocabulary lists. You are becoming attuned to the living system of the language. Then came the long stretch. For years, roughly the second half of his first decade and into the next, the forest grew, but the transformation was incremental. There were no more dramatic discoveries of new animal life, no sudden explosions of color. It was a period of steady, visible growth that somehow felt like a plateau. The psychological test of this phase was profound. The initial excitement of the first shoots had faded, and the ultimate goal of a mature forest still seemed a lifetime away. There was little external validation. The work continued in near total isolation. The environment itself tested this endurance with brutal regularity. The monsoon seasons would arrive with torrential rains and powerful winds, sometimes destroying swathes of young trees. Jadav would walk through the damage, seeing saplings broken and washed away, but each year he would return to replant. And in this cycle of destruction and regrowth, something shifted within him. The work transformed from a sense of duty, a response to a tragedy witnessed long ago, into a deeper, more personal connection with the land itself. The forest was no longer just a project, it was becoming a part of him, and he a part of it. The motivation became internal, rooted in the daily practice itself rather than the distant dream. Every language learner knows this plateau. It is the intermediate stage where the initial rapid progress slows to a crawl. You have the foundations, you can communicate basic ideas, but fluent, effortless conversation remains elusive. This is the great psychological test. The novelty has worn off and the summit seems just as far away as ever. It is easy to question the daily effort when the results are so hard to measure. You will face your own monsoons, periods of frustration, a difficult conversation that leaves you feeling defeated, a week where you feel you've forgotten more than you've learned. The key is the same resilience Jadav demonstrated, the commitment to return and replant after the setback. This is when your relationship with the language must deepen. It can't just be about passing an exam or achieving a goal. It has to become about the quiet satisfaction of the practice itself, the few minutes of reading each day, the enjoyment of a song's lyrics, the small connection made with a new phrase. This internal shift, from learning for a result to engaging for the sake of engagement, is what carries you through the long plateau. It is the cultivation of endurance. And then, after years of quiet work, the forest reached a critical mass. The turning point was not announced with fanfare, but with life. The first returnees were the birds. Species that had abandoned the barren sandbar began to reappear, building nests in the thickening canopy. Their songs were the first external validation that the ecosystem was healing. Then came the small mammals, rabbits, deer, drawn by the new cover and the insects that thrived among the leaves. The forest had achieved a state where it could begin to sustain life on its own terms. It was no longer just a collection of trees Jadav had planted. It was becoming a living, breathing entity. This biological momentum reached its own climax when forestry officials, on a routine patrol, literally stumbled upon what they called a miracle. They were astonished to find a dense, thriving forest where their map showed only an empty sandbar. The story broke, and media attention followed. Jadav Payeng, the forest man of India, became known to the world. Yet amidst the cameras and the interviews, his daily routine remained unchanged. The external recognition was a consequence, not the goal. He still walked the same paths, tending to the forest with the same quiet dedication. This moment has a direct parallel in the journey to fluency. After the long plateau, there comes a point where your knowledge reaches a critical mass. The turning point is not usually a single event, but a series of small realizations that compound. You find yourself understanding the lyrics of a song without trying. You have a conversation where you stop mentally translating your thoughts. The words simply emerge, connected by the grammatical structures you've internalized. This is the fluency equivalent of the forest becoming self-sustaining. The effort of construction gives way to the flow of inhabitation. You are no longer consciously building every sentence from scratch. You are moving within the language. This discovery of your ability by others might come when a colleague remarks on your improved English or when you effortlessly handle a complex situation. But like Jadav, the true satisfaction is internal. The external validation is nice, but it pales in comparison to the private victory of feeling the language become a natural part of your thought process. The goal shifts from achieving fluency to living within it. With the foundation secure and life returning, the forest entered a phase of explosive, self-directed growth. The biodiversity began to compound. It was no longer just about trees and the animals that lived in them. Delicate orchids appeared, finding a home on the bark of older trees. Medicinal herbs sprouted from the forest floor, plants that had not been seen on the island for generations. This botanical richness created a cascade. With a more diverse menu of plants and insects, more complex animals were drawn in. The arrival of predators, the snakes that had once died there were now replaced by thriving populations, signaled that the food web was complete. The most dramatic sign of this maturity was the arrival of large mammals, including a herd of elephants that began to migrate through the new woodland, and even reports of a resident tiger. These animals represented the ultimate validation of a functioning ecosystem, a place of complex interdependencies and natural balance. The forest was now engineering its own environment. The dense root matrix and the canopy's shade acted like a sponge, dramatically improving water retention. The very erosion patterns that had threatened to erase Majuli from the map began to slow, then reverse. The land was healing itself. Jadav's creation had transcended his initial intention. It was no longer a plantation he controlled, but a living, breathing entity with its own rhythms, needs, and destiny. He had planted the seeds, but the forest itself had taken over the design. For the language learner, this is the stage where vocabulary stops being a collection of individual items and starts to connect into living themes. You experience a similar explosion. You no longer learn words in isolation, you learn them in clusters. The word ecosystem brings with it habitat, species, biodiversity, sustainability. These words breed more words, creating rich, interconnected fields of meaning. Your ability to comprehend and express complex ideas flourishes. You start to understand nuance, humor, and irony, the predators of language that only exist in a mature system. You can follow a fast-paced political debate or appreciate the subtle character development in a novel. The language begins to retain itself in your mind, much like the forest retained water. You find that you can recall words more easily because they are connected to a network of related concepts not floating alone. Fluency becomes less about what you know and more about how the words you know interact with each other. The language becomes a living system within you, generating new thoughts and connections that you could not have formed in your native tongue. You are no longer just building a vocabulary. You are inhabiting a complete linguistic world. As the forest matured into a self-sustaining ecosystem, Jadav Payeng's relationship with it underwent a fundamental change. His work evolved from that of a creator to that of a guardian. The daily planting became less frequent. The need for protection became more acute. The very success of the forest attracted new threats. Poachers saw the returning wildlife as a target. Logging interests cast a covetous eye on the valuable timber. The larger climate changes that threatened the region now threatened his life's work. His role shifted to one of vigilant stewardship. He patrolled the boundaries not with a planter's basket but with a watchful eye. At the same time, his isolation ended. The story of the forest man drew visitors, scientists, journalists, and curious individuals who wanted to see the miracle for themselves. Jadav began to teach, sharing his methods and his philosophy with anyone who would listen. He showed them how to plant, how to care for the soil, how to read the signs of the forest. Yet, amidst this new role as a teacher and a public figure, he maintained his personal practice. He still walked the forest daily, not because he had to, but because that connection was the core of his being. The Molai Forest, as it came to be known, was both a sanctuary for wildlife and a profound responsibility for its creator. It was a legacy that required not just creation, but perpetual care. This mirrors the final transition for the advanced language learner. There comes a point where active, structured study gives way to a different kind of engagement. You shift from being a student who is building fluency to a person who is living in the language. The frantic acquisition of new vocabulary slows. Your focus turns to maintenance, refinement, and protection. You must guard against the erosion of fluency, the poachers of neglect and lack of practice. You might consciously consume more complex material to challenge yourself, or you might start to teach others, explaining nuances to fellow learners. This act of teaching solidifies your own understanding in a profound way. Yet, the core of your relationship with the language remains a personal practice. You continue to read, to listen, to engage, not out of obligation, but because it has become an integral part of your intellectual life. The language is now both a tool you use effortlessly and a cherished possession you maintain. The goal is no longer to reach a destination, but to enjoy and care for the rich, complex ecosystem of thought that you have cultivated within yourself over so many years. The work is never truly finished. It simply changes form, from an act of construction to an act of stewardship. Scientific measurements now confirm the forest's profound impact on the regional ecology. Yet Jadav's philosophy remains simple. The forest is my family. His quiet consistency has altered an entire ecosystem, a legacy that will endure for generations. This story reveals the hidden mathematics of persistence. A single daily action, repeated, compounds into a transformation so complete it feels inevitable. The forest was not a miracle, it was the logical outcome of not stopping. So, what is your first seed? Choose one small, consistent practice today. It is the choice to begin cultivating your own fluency, word by word, until it becomes an inevitable, living part of you. If this story of quiet persistence has inspired you to plant your own seeds of language, I invite you to subscribe to English Room. Together, we will continue to explore the world, refining fluency through the lens of profound human stories like this one.